So this meeting is jointly organized by JICA and SET, the program that is supporting economic transformation. And the program is funded by the UK Department for International Development. This is the first meeting at ODI in the new year, and in many ways it may also be one of the most important ones this year. It's a huge challenge that we're facing. We're facing that Africans are facing. The picture of industrialization in African countries isn't always that rosy. We had a speaker here last year, Danny Roderick, who was pointing to the deindustrialization of many poor countries, including African countries. And if you look at the data, then you do see a decline in the ratio of manufacturing value added as a percent of GDP. And it is currently in sub-Saharan Africa at around 11%. And it has been declining over the last decade or two. What's more, we might see labor not going from agriculture into industry, but going into services sector. And this is problematic. This is problematic for a number of reasons. We know that the manufacturing sector is an important sector in the diffusion of innovation, and it's a key sector that is part of economic transformation of countries, together with services, of course, high productivity services. And economic transformation of a country is absolutely key to ensure high quality jobs, not just now but also in the future. It's an agenda, industrialization is an agenda that is led by African countries themselves. They've set ambitious targets for industrialization. If you think about countries like Ethiopia and Tanzania, they have set very ambitious targets for industrialization. The AU 2063, the African Union 2063 agenda puts industrialization also high up the agenda. And I should say that, at least on paper, the international community is also fully behind this now. There is the Sustainable Development Goal number 9, which talks about sustainable and inclusive industrialization, and it has as a target double the share of industry in GDP by the end of the period of 2030. And so we're really talking about reversing a decline. We've seen a decline, and we like to see this increasing. And fortunately, there are also some encouraging signs. Manufacturing, in absolute terms, is growing in African countries. Just because GDP is growing and the share is declining slightly, manufacturing is growing. So there are at least some promising signs, and also there are individual pockets that we will talk about later where we do see some very promising signs. And also the international community is also stepping behind this, whether it's from China, whether it's Japan, and or other donors as well. So we'll discuss these challenges today about industrialization and about how African countries themselves, but also how the donor community can help to reverse the decline in industrialization. And we're joined today by an action panel. We have key thinkers, we've got brilliant officials, and we have practitioners in the field of industrialization. Let me introduce briefly the speakers. So to my left, we've got John Page. He is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He also works at the International Growth Center here in London. But he's got a long career working on African industrialization, having been at the World Bank for a long period of time. And he's just edited 2 books on the topic. I don't know whether you've got a copy we can show around, but maybe on your slides. Well, we then, so he will talk for about 20 minutes. We then have some general comments to start out with. So from Nick Lee, who's the Deputy Chief Economist, and he is sort of the brain and behind a lot of thinking on economic transformation within DFID, and very important there. And then we move to Machiko Nishanka, who is a professor of economics at SOAS, and I think she's also working on industrial policy, most recently in Ethiopia. And that will take us then also to a bit more detail, country detail, where then we go to the experiences of in Ethiopia, and we have the JICA representative here from Ethiopia, Hakimi Jin, who will talk about the work on industrial policy and the challenges of industrialization in Ethiopia. And then we move to a practitioner, to my right, Helen Hai, who set up a shoe factory from the Huaji company in Ethiopia, and we hope to hear on that experience. And she's also a goodwill ambassador for UNIDO. And then finishing off, we have Stephen Gelb, who has the job of putting it all together. But he's not only that, it's difficult. He's also just joined us to lead the work on private sector development at ODI, and he's also stepped in just with one day notice. Unfortunately, Alberto Lemma, who was on the program, couldn't join us today. Okay, that is by way of introductions. So after those comments, there will be time to discuss and take your questions. And of course, we're also joined by around 100 viewers, I think, online as well. So they may be able to put questions through the chat room, and they will appear here on my iPad. Okay, so what I think we should do is now start with the lead presentation by John Page. Over to you.
Great. Well, let me begin by thanking ODI, JICA, and particularly Dirk Willem for inviting me to come here and speak today about the culmination of nearly 5 years' worth of research. In a way, this is a story of one little conversation over a beer and how it grew out of control. About 5 years ago, at a meeting of the African Economic Research Consortium, Finn Tarp, who is the director of UNU Wider in Helsinki, Louis Kasakende, who at the time was the chief economist for the African Development Bank, and I were chatting, literally over a beer in Nairobi, Kenya. And we said, why is there so little industry in Africa? And then, of course, that brought a follow-on question, which is, does it matter? And what should you do about it? Well, what you've heard from Dirk today is it really does matter. And to try to give you a sense of the order of magnitude of the challenge, let me see if I can, there we go. Let me just give you a few really grim statistics about African industrialization. Essentially, today, Africa has ended up more or less where it started. When Kwame Nkrumah first had the vision of industrial development as a way to reverse the colonial system and transform Africa's economies, the average share of industry in GDP in the late 1950s, early 1960s was about 2%. There was an industrial boom in the 50s and 60s, and by the time we got to the end of that period, it was 12 to 15% of GDP in the leading African economies, rose to almost 20%, and then began to fall. And the share of industry in GDP in Africa has been falling continuously since the 1980s. Today, as Dirk Willem said, it's about 10%. That's approximately what it was in the middle of the 1970s. Just to give you a sense of where the rest of the world has gone in that same period, and Helen Hai has lived this experience, Africa's share of manufacturing in GDP is about half that for all developing countries. Per capita manufactured exports, one measure of export dynamism, is about 10% of the developing country average. And Africa's share of global manufacturing industry is smaller today than it was in 1980. Now, Africa is also arguably the poorest continent in the world, so therefore, from what we know about structural transformation, perhaps this simply reflects that as a poorer group of countries, it naturally has a smaller degree of industry. This is what structural transformation is about. But in fact, if we drill down in the data, what we find is that of the 25 countries for which we have data, only 4 African economies actually exceed their predicted value in terms of their per capita income. The rest of them all have a smaller share of manufacturing and GDP than we would expect for their level of per capita income. What's perhaps more worrying is that the stars of the African transformation story, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania, Uganda, Mozambique, all have smaller shares of GDP in manufacturing than we would expect from their level of income. If we add the resource-rich economies, things get really alarming. So what this conversation over a beer led us to do was to launch a collaborative research project among the three institutions. And we tried to answer this one simple question: why is there so little industry in Africa? And it led us to an approach, and it was interesting because over lunch we were talking with Nick Lee today, and he said, which is something I feel very strongly, economists tend to approach the question of industrial development as a black box of a firm that responds to changes in its environment. If we switch prices, it moves this way. If we change the exchange rate, it moves that way. If we get rid of some regulations, perhaps it moves up. But we never try to unbundle the box. We never try to look at the firm itself. And what the new literature on industrial economics and development is telling us, work that was really pioneered by people like Joe Stiglitz, but to John Sutton here at the London School of Economics, to Nick Bloom and others at Stanford, is that what goes on inside the firm and between firms is as important as what goes on outside the firm. So that really led us to two other questions, which is what makes firms more competitive and what makes countries more attractive to competitive firms? Because that is really the story of the industrial transformation of the global economy. Literally hundreds of thousands of firms, maybe in East Asia, who achieved levels of productivity and quality that allowed them to enter global markets and compete with the dominant industrial producers of the, quote, North. So what makes firms capable of doing this? And if you're a country, what makes you more attractive to those kinds of firms? From the point of view of an African policymaker, we thought those were the two central questions we ought to try to be answering. So we had to have some maintained hypotheses, at least to shorten the domain of search among these questions. And what we said was, well, really we think there are three broad trends in the world economy, and here I think I should give credit where it's due. Much of this thinking came out of joint work that Paul Collier and I did for the 2009 UNIDO Industrial Development Report, where we tried to understand what determined industrial location globally. We argued really there were three things: exports and competition. Competition because it's a constant spur to the firm to improve productivity, but as some of you know, I'm sure, there's also a large literature in the economics profession about whether or not exports actually create learning and how they create learning. And they can make firms more productive as well. So we wanted to understand the competition and export story. Firm capabilities. I always smile when I say this because economists love to reinvent things in order that we can claim them as our own. If you talk to a business school professor and you say, you know, management must really matter, making a firm more productive, they sort of look at you as you've descended from Mars. Of course, that's what business schools do. That's part of their practice of work. But economists, because we viewed the firm as a black box, didn't really spend much time thinking about that. So we create a new label. We call them firm capabilities, and now suddenly they're the hot topic of interest in industrial economics. But we wanted to understand better how the tacit knowledge and work practices of a firm influence productivity and quality in the firm. And we also wanted to understand whether or not firms could learn capabilities from each other, whether or not they spilled over. And finally, something which, of course, Paul Krugman brought very much back to the attention of the profession when he won the Nobel Prize, economic geography and the influence of clustering and agglomeration on the productivity of firms. So we said these three drivers of industrial productivity must have something to do with why some firms are more productive than others. And if you think about it from the point of view of a policymaker, they may provide some key tools as to how you can become more attractive to firms that are more competitive. So we began to try to do some research along all of these lines. And we basically set it up as a cross-country comparative research project. We did 11 countries, 9 in Africa, 2 in Asia, Vietnam and Cambodia, which are interesting because 20 years ago, on almost every measurable aspect of industrial structure, they looked exactly like African countries do today. Yet they've changed fundamentally over that period of time. We're very proud of the fact that we all agreed that national researchers were the key to doing this. So in each case, we used national research teams based in national think tanks, paired with a number of international experts who could help them in some cases on technical issues, but consistently using national researchers. And we tried to do three things. detailed country-level case studies of the history of industrial policy and the history of industrial development on a country level, econometric studies of the stock of existing firm-level data in each of the countries in which we were working, and some qualitative studies where we actually went out and talked to business people about what was going on, something, again, kind of unusual for many economists. The results of the research, I want to just sketch them out quickly because then I want to get to the policy story, is that in the case of exports and productivity, we confirmed a lot of previous understandings of the story. More productive firms select into exporting. They have to, because they're the only ones who can compete. But exporting further raises your productivity. So firms actually learn during the process of exporting. Large firms, not surprisingly, because oftentimes, at least in the African context, they're more productive, tend to be more likely to export than small firms. And the learning effects are stronger in some very interesting dimensions. They're stronger for nationally owned firms. They're stronger in more sophisticated products. They're stronger if you're exporting to higher income or more distant markets. And they're higher in the initial years of exporting. And I'll come back to that when I talk about firm capabilities. But we also found some surprises which we think are quite relevant to the Africa story. Many African exporters are born global. They are created for the purpose of exporting. Helen can tell us a story today about Ethiopia, of a firm born global. Very few firms in the African context learn to export. That is, begin supplying the domestic market and then jump into exporting. Export activity is very persistent. Once you're a successful exporter, you remain in the export market, and the productivity premium tends to increase the smaller the share of exports in national GDP or the smaller the share of exports in the sector's output. So these were some of the things we learned about exporting. Firm capabilities. A striking insight that really comes from some pioneering work by John Sutton and his colleagues at the LSE is that one of the key constraints to industrialization in Africa is it lacks capable mid-sized firms. It lacks firms that can effectively manage a labor force of about 50 to 100 workers. We also found that firms learn capabilities from exporting. And our econometric work is quite definitive in this, that the positive relationship between exporting and productivity is mainly due to process and quality innovations that are undertaken by firms. These are the two dimensions of firm capabilities. Finally, firm-to-firm knowledge transfers turn out to be quite important in the process of learning capabilities. That is, if you supply inputs to a more capable firm, or you purchase the output of a more capable firm, the interactions between that firm and your firm actually cause your firm to learn. One of the striking things we found is that those interactions are much denser in East Asia than they are in Africa. And to illustrate this, I just want to show you two neighborhoods. The left-hand neighborhood is Vietnam. The right-hand neighborhood is Kenya, which is arguably the most industrial developed economy that we looked at. The first column to the right of the white is the suppliers to international investors, foreign direct investment firms. What you can see, of course, the next one is customers, and the third one are competitors. What you can see, of course, is that that entire left-hand block is completely full of firms. The right-hand block is almost completely empty. How did we find this out? We went starting by asking, who are your major foreign investors? We found them. We asked, who are your suppliers? Who are your customers? This is what we found. And this same mapping would be the case if we were to look at Cambodia versus Tanzania, or, to put on the right-hand side, any African country. Part of the problem of the reason why there were fewer than we would hope capable mid-sized firms in Africa is that we have very few domestic linkages, very few domestic value chain relationships of enterprises in Africa. What about agglomeration? Well, when we started out, we discovered that there were very, very few studies of agglomeration economies in low-income countries. Most of what we know about the productivity-enhancing effects of clusters or agglomerations comes from high-income or middle-income countries. We've done some of the very first studies of productivity causing effects of agglomerations in low-income countries for a relatively small number of countries, as you can see. What we find is the story is the same, whether you're a low-income country or a high-income country. But as with so many things in development, the source of agglomeration economies actually changes with the level of income. In a low-income country, you are much better off being located near other people who are doing the same thing you're doing. It's called a cluster economy. In a high-income country, think Silicon Valley, you're actually much better off being located in the center of an urban economy with a huge diffusion of productive activities and creative energy in universities and other kinds of centers of knowledge. So the key constraint, if you will, on developing agglomerations in low-income countries is to convince a critical mass of firms doing more or less the same thing, at least along the same supply chain, to move together into an industrial location. Failing that, you don't realize the kinds of cluster economies that one would hope to gain. But there is a trade-off, and the trade-off is that where markets are poorly integrated, in economies like Cambodia or Ethiopia, the more people doing the same thing you pack into a single geographical area, the more competition you have. And so there's a trade-off actually between the productivity-enhancing effects of agglomeration and the competitive disincentives to agglomerate. Small lesson for policymakers: if you have an outward-oriented agglomeration, you don't face that trade-off, which we'll come back to when we talk about policy. So what does this all mean then for public policy? We think it has some very important implications, but we thought we'd better ask the zero question first. There is still a good deal of pessimism, I think, embodied in my old friend Danny Roderick, among others, that really Africa's opportunity in the global economy has passed it by. We don't believe that's true. We believe, in fact, that perhaps today, more than at any time in the last 20 years, Africa has a better chance of breaking into the global economy. And the reason for that is changes in Asia, rising real wages in China, congestion, other problems. Trade in tasks, the fact that one no longer has to produce a fully vertically integrated product, but can take a single slab of the value chain in which you can become competitive. And finally, something which we think is very important in the African context, the fact that the value chains that today dominate global trade have resulted in a complete blurring of the definitions between manufacturing, agriculture, and services. If you think about it, and I heard this wonderful example from Patrick Lowe, who used to be the chief economist of the WTO about a month ago in Nairobi. The custodial contractor that sweeps the floor in Helen's plant in Ethiopia is a services exporter, because they're engaged as part of the value chain in an export. Beyond that, of course, you have direct services exports, such as back office operations, tourism, other kinds of activities, and we have agro-industrial value chains. If you think about Africa, it has a large number of sources of competitive advantage in a number of these, what we call industries without smokestacks. But what is fortunate from the policymaker's point of view is that many of the same things that you need to do for manufacturing are also beneficial for industries without smokestacks. So you can have a strategy for industrial development writ large rather than writ small. But what one then confronts is the reality that in Africa, while some firms are competitive and are capable of succeeding, there aren't as many competitive firms as there are in East Asia or in some other parts of the developing world. And that means that you have to think about how you create more competitive firms. The first thing that we came to conclude was that the current flavor of the aid industry in Africa, which is for investment climate reform, is sufficient, not sufficient, it's kind of necessary. It's important. It focuses on competition, but it's not sufficient. And the reason why it's not sufficient is because it doesn't recognize that you have these three fundamental drivers of firm productivity: export performance, agglomeration, and firm capabilities. If you're going to have a strategy to develop industry in Africa, which is a relatively sparse industrial landscape, you actually have to treat these three jointly at the same time. And our country case studies led us to the conclusion that, yes, indeed, one of the key things that was different between Cambodia and Vietnam and the 9 countries in Africa we'd studied is that they had been far more successful in dealing with these 3 drivers at the same time and across a broad range of activity relative to African countries. What does it mean? Well, the first thing is then that we have to reform the investment climate agenda. A, it's not going away, and B, it's important. Topic A is probably to get the World Bank out of the doing business business. It simply diverts attention of policymakers, including such leading lights as President Kagame in Rwanda, from what's really important. The focus on infrastructure and skills is fundamental, and what we know is that the aid industry has neglected infrastructure and skills in the past 25 years. That's the share of aid that goes to economic infrastructure of the OECD DAC over the 30-year period in question. And there's a need to support institutional development for those institutions that are relevant to agglomerations and firm capabilities, foreign investment agencies, and special economic zones. There's a need for countries to mount what we call an export push. There are high initial costs to exporting, which is often why I think African firms don't learn to export, they actually are born global. So that entering the global market means that you need a broadly owned strategy and effective institutions and strong leadership from the top. Those are the characteristics of the export push in East Asia, beginning with Japan and running right through to Cambodia. And you also need strong support for regional institutions and infrastructure because so many of Africa's economies are landlocked. In terms of capabilities and clusters, the strongest thing one can do to strengthen firm capabilities is probably to mount an export push. But beyond that, you need to get those foreign firms that have capabilities into Africa's economies. And that means effective foreign direct investment promotion agencies. And finally, as we saw, strengthen the value chain relationships between domestic investors and foreign investors. And here, parenthetically, natural resource exporters in Africa have a very good opportunity to do that. Because as opposed to other countries, the foreign investors are actually deeply desirous of being able to engage in those economies. In terms of clusters, agglomeration economies, as we pointed out, create a collective action problem. And SEZs, special economic zones, famous, of course, in Asia, for creating clusters. The key thing is that Africa's SEZs almost completely fall short of world class in terms of infrastructure, in terms of regulations, and in terms of human skills. So strengthening them and then strengthening links between the special economic zones and the domestic suppliers and producers is essential if you're going to have this integrated approach to industrialization. Finally, a couple of words on aid and trade. The first one is that coordinating aid and trade is absolutely essential. I think it's a reality of the global economy. Harder to say that here in the UK than almost anywhere else, that aid will be insufficient to address the sustainable development goals, but it can be leveraged better. And one of the ways it can be leveraged better is by getting the trade ministry and the aid ministry to work together. First priority, fix aid for trade and tie it to trade logistics. It would take me another 5 minutes to explain the accounting principles used, giving credit for aid for trade, but let's simply say that it's a quality. It's a quality of bookkeeping which would make the auditors for Enron Corporation be embarrassed, okay? Unify and streamline AGOA and the EPAs. Support the regional economic communities. Focus aid for trade on EPZs and make them world class. Develop a new practice area for donor agencies in firm capabilities. Studies of management training suggest that it does pay off. And finally, one last cautionary note. Give African governments the policy space to take initiatives and make their own mistakes. That may be the single most important message to give. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed.
Oh, but Dirk, my friend Paul Collier tells me you should never give a public talk without a shameless book plug. 2 shameless book plugs. The first one is we have a book that's just been issued, 2016, by the Brookings Institution Press called Made in Africa, Learning to Compete in Industry. In honor of Paul, we call it the airport book. We don't expect it to sell at airports, but we do hope it's readable and tells this story in a much sort of more full way. And secondly, the country case studies will appear in the summer by an Oxford University Press book called Manufacturing Transformation, Comparative Studies of Industrial Development in Africa and Emerging Asia. If you want a preview, we have working papers on both the Brookings and wider websites.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. And for the brilliant talk, sort of outlining the challenges, and also an agenda for change. So investment climate isn't enough. thinking about firm capabilities, when you think about clustering, agglomeration, special economic zones, investment promotion agencies, and the like. Okay, let's go to the comments now. The first set of comments by Nick Lee. Over to you.
Thanks, Dirk. Thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here at ODI. The chairs are really comfy. Dirk was kind enough to invite me to comment on Danny Roderick talk a couple of months ago. And of course, Danny Roderick is quite pessimistic about industrialisation in Africa, as John was saying, and rather thinks the ship might have sailed and all sorts of problems there. And so my job as a discussant was to be relentlessly optimistic. And now John has put out a much more optimistic picture. I guess my job as a discussant is to throw water on the flames and be relentlessly pessimistic. So I apologize if anybody was suffering under both my discussant contributions and now thinks that that's contradictory. But so apologies for that. Okay, firstly, I want to say a couple of words in praise of dark satanic mills. Why is industrialisation in Africa important? It's important, as John says, because it's the only path we know of that can give a fast track convergence to OECD incomes that's open to most countries. The other way of doing it is to discover a large quantity of oil or a large quantity of diamonds. But if you can't discover that, if you haven't got that, industrialisation is the only route we actually know of to get you to high income quickly. As Roderick says, so he says it in sort of typically sort of jargonistic way, manufacturing exhibits unconditional convergence in productivity. Now, you know, everyone that I know at home falls asleep at that phrase, but in actual fact, unconditional convergence in productivity sums up what we're trying to do in the development industry. It's probably, you know, the most important collection of jargon that you can muster. So that's the first reason. The second reason is its effect on poverty. Manufacturing creates a lot of jobs. And by creating a lot of jobs, it creates millions of multiplier linkages deep into an economy that spread through and enable the benefits to seep through. And the third reason, which is really important, which is unbelievably important, is its effect on politics. That jobs and rising incomes diversify the balance of power. It's so much harder to be an autocracy in a highly diversified, sophisticated manufacturing economy. It starts pushing back. It starts demanding more things of its leaders, and enables people to press for the kind of institutions. Come in if you need a seat. Come in. Enables people to press for the kinds of institutions that they might want. So Chile, South Korea, East Asia. So this industrialisation of Africa is incredibly important, and this research is incredibly important. So and most welcome. So what do I think of John's findings? Okay. Well, I mean, I'm trying to be pessimistic and nasty here. But you know, I'm quite excited about these findings. So it's great to get confirmation around some of the things that we kind of knew already. It's great to I think the framework of exports, capabilities, agglomeration is great. The new insights, I love some of these new insights. Like the learning is more pronounced with domestic firms. It's more pronounced when you're doing a far export to a high value export or a far export. It's good to have the confirmation about management constraints. That's great. I love the little comment in agglomeration that quite often your competition effects offset your productivity effects. So firms might be so uncompetitive that by bringing them together, they don't want to be brought together because it actually makes them compete with each other. So there's a bit of a hurdle on agglomeration that you might have to get firms over. And I agree with his prescriptions. I looked through your presentation, John, and I think I can distill it to 7 prescriptions, all of which are completely reasonable. So I think there's sort of 7 pillars that came out of that: infrastructure, trade facilitation, special economic zones, integration with domestic value chains, FDI attraction, skills, particularly in management, possibly in specialist zones, specialist areas, and deal facilitation. So providing information on potential markets. You'll have missed those 7, but I think they're 7. And I think you could argue for some others. Quite a lot of them, funnily enough, were in the 1992 East Asian Miracle Report, which I remember studying at college. Okay, so now I have to be nasty. But this approach doesn't answer the question that happened in the bar 5 years ago. So when John is in the bar 5 years ago and says, why is there so little industry in sub-Saharan Africa? He hasn't answered the question. So he has answered, very sensibly that the various things increase productivity, and these policies would all be, very sensible, but it doesn't answer the question. And I need to take him to a task for an innocuous little bullet in his presentation that looks simple but is profoundly unsimple. I quote, there needs to be a broadly owned strategy and effective institutions, brackets, leadership from the top. Now, I would argue that this is the fundamental problem. That this, far from being a little bullet hidden somewhere in the middle of a otherwise technical talk, is actually the crux of the whole issue. Why haven't African countries created leadership from the top around industrialisation, and why haven't there been a broadly owned strategy and effective institutions? It's not a small point, it's the point. The rest is actually the common sense outworking of that little comment. So I think you've dodged the question a bit, John. DFID has found consistently that the lack of alignment between what's going on in the politics and what goes on in the economy for industrialisation is consistently the bottleneck for nearly all of the poorest countries that we deal with. And it's a very deep question. Now, Helen High is going to talk later on. I'm delighted to tell you. And she started up this the famous shoe exporter in Ethiopia. And I won't steal her thunder. She'll have lots to say to you. But it's very interesting, the question, why Helen chose Ethiopia and later chose Rwanda. And it's about this broadly owned strategy for industrialisation. It's the sponsorship from the top. I would just offer you very briefly, because I'm out of time, 1 minute, some hypotheses about this deep question. Why has there been a lack of coordinated push for industrialisation? And I think there's 4 potential reasons. Firstly, because export manufacturing requires a sacrifice. It costs. You have to stump up for the infrastructure, and you probably have to align the exchange rate so that it lowers consumption. You have to defer current consumption to get future investment. And that's politically more difficult. I think possibly because it potentially creates many winners, and African elites might want to keep control over who the winners are. It's a natural instinct. It might be because elites are getting enough from commodity industries and from non-tradable sectors. And that is kind of enough to keep the show on the road. So paradoxically, this enormous commodity shock that is facing Africa and will continue to play out over the next decade may in the long term be good news for industrialisation strategy. And my final suggestion is that we tend to find that very few elites are involved in the manufacturing sector. So there's not a natural convergence of interests between the people that want to do industrialisation and the people that are making the decisions about industrialisation. I think I've overstepped my time. Thank you very much.
Great, that's very great. Thank you very much for making the political economy point. Machiko, over to you.
Okay, thank you for inviting me as a panel. And I have 5 minutes, so I will try to be very quick. I have made little note, so I will go through, and I know I'm not going to finish everything, but at least you have a note from me. Industrialization, of course, it's critical part of Africa's structural transformation agenda, and John's Learning to Compete project has really generated a very rich set of empirical studies of the farm level studies in case studies of 9 countries, Africa and Asia. And the main question asked is simple. He said it is raise farmers' competitiveness, it's micro-level issues through learning to export or learning by exporting through agglomeration, all this. And the policy that Nick called 7 pillars are not controversial. All this very reasonable. So for me to say, well, what is the bigger question surrounding industrialization issues in Africa? We have to go a bit more seeing challenges, opportunities, Africa's industrialization beyond the micro-level question and raising farmers' competitiveness. We have to think what sort of industrialization, sort of nature of industrialization are feasible and necessary or desirable in Africa. Shallow industrialization, deeper industrialization, there are differences between them, and we have to evaluate that in terms of sustainability long term. In 3 dimensions, for me, it is ecological, social, financial sustainability, Africa's structural transformation process. So that's one thing. Second thing, what sort of broader policy, institutional, environmental are required to push? What we see, it is, as Nick mentioned, there are pessimists and optimists about Africa's industrialization future. And in reality, is structural transformation started in this new millennium, but still it is not economy-wide, a big dense one. It is fragmented. Still it's isolated and shallow, fragile base yet. So do we need strategic framework at the macro and the regional levels? So I personally think structural transformation is not just about changing composition of sectorial composition in economy. It had to be purposeful, concerted societal effort towards creating well-articulated, dense economic structure where economic activities are closely linked to each other in a dynamic, coordinated manner. If we look at it this way, as Murphy, Vishny, Schleifer all said earlier on, that we have to think about how to overcome coordination failure as market failure. And diversification into high productive activities with large positive externalities and dense dynamic spillover, especially over time, that is what we have to aim at. And that has to create inclusiveness, ex ante, inclusive growth through creating opportunities ex ante in the growth process. So achieving twin objectives, both economic and social transformation. And personally, I think creation of articulated economy through regional integration has to get a bit more attention. Global economy, global demand is shrinking, or not shrinking, but not expanding fast enough. Advanced countries, there is secular stagnation going on everywhere, and the emerging economy, there is slowing down. So it's environment changing. Demographic decline is in not only advanced countries, but in many Asian countries as well. So we have to think long term. Global breaking into global market is important, but create continent-wide big market is very important. And we have to think Africa's demographic dividend, which is a young continent, as important productive asset, as well as expanding purchasing power and aggregate demand. And that's why articulated economy would generate itself regional, domestic, continent demand growing. So to me, it's important enhancing market size in the region by increasing Africa's own effective demand and also through increasing consumption, purchasing power, and per capita income. So we need to think big way on that sense. So learning by doing is important. Structural transformation involves dynamic economies. We need cross-border production clustering, dense production supply relations, and creating cumulative causation effect, and attract FDI for technology and knowledge acquisition to enhance skill-based knowledge asset and productive human capital, not just in place of exploitation of cheap labor. To me, strategic participation global value chain and creating supply production network need constant upgrading and linkage development, focus on that. So achieve also strategic participation, technology-driven globalization, but based more leapfrogging to clean, green, mobile technology with smaller sunk cost, and not simply emulating industrialization path of the past, because, we have different, in the new millennium, we have a different agenda. We have to have industrialization together with agrarian transformation, that it should have creating non-farm employment and food security. We have to have spatial agglomeration, also reducing negative externalities like congested, overcrowded cities. Addis, Dar, Nairobi, it's so negative externalities there. So we have to think big. I know I don't have time anymore. Just to say we have to think how to make structural transformation as a development process in the 21st century. And there is building block fundamentals, process what involved, and how to create the goal. Why Africa couldn't make before millennium, I put it out. And as I see, there is a big framework we have to think of as a development framework, which all other policies, including industrial policy, agricultural policy, technology policy, and all others, together with the macroeconomic framework, has to be nested in the long-run vision. And in the long run, we have to think big and then start something feasible at hand in the short run. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I think this just confirms that industrialization and transformation is a really important topic, but also how complex it is, and that so many things need to be happening at the same time to get it working. And I think that goes back to maybe also Nick's comments that we probably want to discuss in the discussion about actually how then, what do you do next on this so challenging agenda. But before we do that, let's first go to the discussion around Ethiopia. And Ethiopia seems to be on this path of trying to industrialize and transforming, and it looks to be going quite well. But I think maybe you can discuss in 5 minutes initially before we move to Helen. And I should say that Kimiaki Jin is from the JICA who's co-hosting this meeting today.
Yeah, thank you very much. My point is about industrial policy. The effectiveness of industrial policy by the government is still a debatable issue. But what we are trying to do is that, as a learning process, we want to actually implement the kind of industrialization policy in Africa. As you know, Ethiopia is one of the best performers in economy more than last decade. And government of Ethiopia has been practicing different types of industrial policies. First, in early 2000, they said that ADRI, agriculture development industrialization. Then one of the successful cases, floriculture, cut flower exportation, which is quite a significant achievement in Ethiopia. And then from late 2000s, I think they shifted to more broader export promotion by encouraging the industry sector, and particularly for the manufacturing. But these days, their priority shifted to the FDI attraction because very weak domestic private sector. So the vertical linkage of with FDI can create the more dynamic export potential. But based on those FDI attraction, the latest policy of the government is to create the industrial park in order to create the agglomeration and also good environment for the investors. So what we are doing as JICA consists 2 points. One is the policy level learning. And second point is the capacity development in farm level. In the policy level learning, because of the request from the government of Ethiopia, who were eager to learn from Asian experience, we launched the policy, so-called industrial policy dialogue, which has been continued for 6 years now, and we are planning to continue more. But for the first 3 years, we organized a 1-week dialogue session for 4 times a year. Then the second 3 years, twice a year. But what we have been discussing was about how to analyze the effectiveness of ADRI, agriculture development industrialization, and also productivity improvement through Kaizen promotion. And of course, export promotion and FDI attraction. And these days, there are intensive discussion on the creation of industrial park, because the government has very ambitious plan to establish the park in the country. And in the farm level, the Kaizen, as I said, the Kaizen promotion is one of the key contributions. Kaizen is a management tool for the quality and productivity improvement, mainly in manufacturing, but can be applied to in the different sectors, public sectors or health sectors, and so on. So this Kaizen promotion is done by the organization called the Ethiopian Kaizen Institute, which is organized by the government after our cooperation started. And you may have more detailed information on Kaizen if you Google it. But in my understanding, Kaizen has 2 major characters. One is to introduce the more rational approach of resource allocation by measuring performance, calculating the requirement, and also reallocating those resources. And second point is to introduce the more bottom-up type participatory nature to utilize tacit knowledge of the floor workers, and also create more motivation to participate in the production system. So those Kaizen approach can also stimulate the creation of big mass of middle-size of companies who can really accelerate the economic growth potential. So that's my comment.
Okay, thanks very much indeed. It just so goes to show that, I mean, you've been in the country for quite some time, and JICA has been involved in industrial policy dialogue for a long period of time. And also issues like around Kaizen, it's a very time-intensive, labor-intensive thing to do in order to get industrial policy working, get firms to get to higher productivity, to coordinate a range of issues around industrial parks. It takes a lot of time and effort. Okay, now let's move to Helen, and we've already discussed, talked a little bit about your company that you've set up, and so we were eager to hear on your experiences.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start with my real stories in Africa. I came to Ethiopia in October 2011. It took me 3 months from decide to investment to actual export from Ethiopia to the U.S. market. In the following 6 months, I doubled the export revenue in Ethiopia in the shoe sector. By the end of year 1, I recruited 2,000 local workers. By the end of year 2, I recruited 4,000 local workers. At this point, you're probably wondering, why did I came to Ethiopia? The answer is, I did not pick Ethiopia. It was Ethiopia who picked me. The story started in March 2011, when the late Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Meles, had a meeting with Professor Justin Lin, the chief economist of the World Bank. And the Prime Minister asked Justin in terms of poverty reduction and economic transformation. Justin advised him 3 things. Number 1, he said, job creation, it is the key for poverty reduction. And secondly, he said, the fundamental secret for the economic transformation in China in the 1980s and Asian Four Tiger in the 1960s, because they captured the window of opportunity during industrialization shifting, which they created millions of jobs. This enabled them for jump start in their economic transformation. At this point, I want to draw you for some figures. In China, back in 1978, the GDP per capita is only $154, which is less than 1/3 of the sub-Saharan Africa countries. But the economic development in China has been a miracle in the past 35 years, on average 9.8 annual growth. And most importantly, 600 million people has been lifted out of the international poverty line. According to World Bank, since 1960s, if we look at the development community, the number of the people living under the international poverty line in the world, if we exclude China, the number didn't decline. So in terms of that, China made the biggest contribution in terms of poverty reduction. And then if we go back to the Chinese economy, last year the GDP per capita, in 2014, the GDP per capita in China is 7,500. And then according to 2014, and then according to forecast, China is going to double that by 2020. What does that mean? That means China is going to move from a more labor-intensive economy to a more capital-incentive economy. And that means a lot of jobs have to be relocated out of China. What's the jobs relocation? Currently, China's population is 1.3 billion. Roughly 10% of them are engaged in manufacturing, so 130 million people. And out of the 130 million people, 85 million people are labor-intensive manufacturing. So this round of job relocation is far more complicated with the last 2 rounds. Because in 1960, when Japan was relocating, we're talking about 9.7 million people. And in 1980s, when Korea is relocating, we're talking about 2.3 million people. This round, 85 million. Where does those jobs going to go? Some people say Southeast Asia, but we would argue Southeast Asia does not have enough population. Vietnam, 88 million population only. Cambodia, 14 million. Myanmar, 48 million. That's why we're seeing, if you're looking at the wage increase in Vietnam in the past 5 years, it's even higher than China. And I would say this is the opportunity actually for Africa, because Africa is a continent with 1.2 billion population, and most of them are young people desperate for jobs. This is the opportunity for them. And then so in a way, I argue actually, John did answer the question why 5 years ago there isn't manufacturing in Africa, but now it is happening because he said there's changes in Asia, and I think this 85 million of jobs actually is going to be a big component into this round of relocation. So the last thing actually Professor Justin advised the late Prime Minister is in terms how to do it, how to start with. He said, you need to create a quick, successful examples because that will bring inspiration, leadership, confidence to Ethiopia and to the continent. That is how the story started. The late Prime Minister went to China 6 months later, brought a group of investors. I was among them. That is how I came to Ethiopia. So I would say it is leadership and vision who brought industrialization into Africa continent. And what happened since 2013? Let me tell you. Prior to the success of the shoe factory in Ethiopia, Ethiopia has an industrial zone. They struggled 5 years to attract international manufacturers become a residence. After we created 4,000 jobs, I've been asked by the Prime Minister of Ethiopia become an advisor. And my first task is to help the government to promote the government newly built industrial zone in Addis Ababa. It took us less than 3 months without any advertisement to lease out all the 22 factory units. Only 8 of them are built, 14 of them are still on the plan. We brought the international manufacturing in. I showed them to the 4,000 jobs I created and showed them the balance sheet, tell them how the money actually has been made. They signed the lease immediately. Success brings success. And it is also the same year, back in 2013, World Bank, the first time in their history, they gave 250 million to support industrialization in Africa, in Ethiopia, to support the second phase of the industrial zone development. And also, this success did not just stay in Ethiopia. The president of Rwanda realized this is also work for them. The president of Senegal, they all came us to help. So last year, we helped Rwanda to build the first garment factory for export. Hundreds of jobs immediately being created after 3 months. A lot of people argue Rwanda is not ready for manufacturing because it's a landlocked country. But we are taking cotton from Burundi, we are taking textiles from Uganda. So through industrialization, we are making Rwanda from a landlocked country to a land-connected country. And also in Senegal, we helped Senegal to build the first industrial zone. Phase 1 will be complete early this year, and I believe this year you are going to see thousands of jobs will be created in Senegal. And because those successes, the president of Ghana, president of Ivory Coast, even the new president of Nigeria, they all came to us saying, how can you help us for industrialization? So I would say actually right now, on the ground in Africa, there is an industrialization movement going on already. And then the second thing I want to share with you, private sector did not come to Africa to do aid. They come to Africa to do business, but through business, they achieve the development goals. If anybody is telling you it's very easy to do manufacturing in Africa, that must be a lie. Let me share with you my real experience. When I first go to Ethiopia, I met the Prime Minister and the Minister. They told me, Helen, you are doing 100% export. All your raw material will be tax-free. But in reality, it is not the Prime Minister or the Minister sitting at the port clearing my goods. It's probably somebody at 25 years old doing that. And you ask that person to make a decision he never made before. It's not easy. I have the brush to brush the shoes. They say this is the brush to brush human teeth. It needs to be taxed. I have a machine to make a hole on the shoe. They say this looks like an illegal weapon. It cannot even get it cleared into the country. So what I have to do as an entrepreneur, I have to personally meet the Director General of the tax, get his organization chart, understood. He has 6 deputy director generals, and I went to meet each of them. When I meet each of them, I get the names and the telephone numbers of the next 2 layer managers below each of them. And then I get these 20 people into a meeting room. I prepared a presentation telling them, who am I, why I came to the country, what I've done, what am I going to do? Most importantly, the problem I have encountered. And afterwards, I invited all of them to the production floor, seeing from the beginning to the end. Then everything became rosy. At this point, you're probably wondering, Helen, why did you take such a kind of effort to stay in Africa? I would say there's a big information asymmetry when you are outside and when you are inside. Before I came to Africa, what do I know about Africa? From BBC, from CNN? What I know is about war, disease, corruption. That's probably the main word I would say about Africa. But while actually inside of Africa, I see another perspective. I share with you two examples. When I first came to Ethiopia, I went on a field trip with the minister to some rural area. And I saw some children that suffer from hunger. So on behalf of the company, I wrote a check of 100,000 US dollars. I gave it to the minister. I said, please use this money to buy some food for those poor children. You know what happened? The minister looked at the check and he returned it back to me. He said, Helen, I don't want fish from you. I want you to teach us how to catch the fish. I want you to use this money to buy some machinery to my country to teach us how to do manufacturing. Yes, there are problems in Africa, and I work closely with the minister. I would say there's times I would call, in Ethiopia, I would call the minister in the evening, and he has a very busy schedule the next day. But he would meet me 7 o'clock in his office and trying to understand my problem. As an investor, there are problems, but as long as you have a government officer willing to come to the office early than the cleaner trying to understand problem, you know there's somebody is holding your hand trying to solve them. So that I would say there is the big information asymmetry about Africa. You can only see the real picture when you are underground. And then I want to show you, okay, some quick thing about this, the story of Felix. This one?
Should work, I think. You talk.
Okay. I got this email from Felix from Rwanda out of the blue, and then he's a 26 years old graduate, couldn't find jobs after graduation. And then this is something he wrote me May last year, and I want to read it to you. He said, hello, Madam Helen, how are you doing? He's in Rwanda, everything's doing well. Because since January, I'm working for Madam Candy in C&H Garments as a warehouse supervisor. It's a very good company, and I learned a lot in garment industry. Madam Candy is a very nice boss and a good teacher. I have also learned to speak some Chinese language, and I hope that in 1 year it will improve. Helen, I could also like to appreciate you for that opportunity. Hard work is the only way I can find a way to say thank you. Without you, I could not reach where I am, and I very much recognize whatever you did for me. Hope that till one day we could meet each other so that I could hold your hand and say thank you. Warm greetings from Kigali, Rwanda. I just want to say I got this email from him out of blue, how it takes for somebody I've never met in my life to write me something from thousands of miles away, because this is what we created in Rwanda, and this is the hopes we created for those young people. This is the real picture from Rwanda. C&H Garments made in Rwanda. And I want to say, to summarize, if we're talking about, in the new SDG, a life of dignity for all, I'm a strong believer in strong leadership, sustainable commitment, and successful examples. I believe those are the things going to bring Africa from vision to action, from dreams to reality. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting example. Very good. Stephen, over to you.
Well, thank you, Dirk. That's a bit of a hard act to follow, I have to say. I don't think I can be quite that inspiring, and I appreciate what Helen had to say. I agree and like a lot of it. As Dirk mentioned, I've just arrived here at ODI and in the UK, for that matter, 1 week ago, to start and build a program at ODI on private sector development. And because that's my task over the next months and years, I really appreciated very much not just what Helen said, although that was inspiring, but also what John had to say and some of the points that he made. And in particular, I want to underline his argument about the need to think about what firm capabilities are all about, and where they come from, how they can be developed, and the need for economists in general, and economic policymakers in particular, to think much harder about what goes on inside what he called the black box of the firm. As he mentioned, economists go to people who work in business schools and share with them their new insights, and the people at business schools sort of shrug their shoulders and say, well, we've been saying this for decades. I've myself have had that experience, and I've learned a lot, I think, from talking to people in business schools over recent years about firm capabilities and how they can be developed. And that's going to be, in fact, one of the major focus areas for our private sector development program at ODI over the coming years. And so I really am pleased that a week after I get here, we have somebody like John with all his experience coming and sort of reinforcing this message. And thank you for the marketing job, John, in that respect. A couple of things that I just wanted to say, because I don't want to take up too much time, but just a couple of things about capabilities and capability development, sort of fleshing out a little bit what John had to say. The first is that it's important to recognize that capabilities and developing them takes time and takes resources for firms. It doesn't just happen automatically, and it doesn't just happen within the firm costlessly. One of the most important things that is involved, actually, and particularly in a developing country context, I think, is the time that it takes of the small number of managers in the firm who are capable and who need to lead capability development over time, who, while they're developing capabilities, also have to look after the core business of the firm, keeping the production going, keeping products being sold, and so on. And so that constraint, allocating management resources to capability development, is a very important one, and more so, I think, in the African context. This is not an insight that's from me. It comes from the business school literature, but actually I think before that even from early development economists like Hirschman and Edith Penrose, who made these sorts of points back in the 1950s. And I think we need to revisit those points in thinking about that. But there is an opportunity cost to developing capabilities. But I think that in many African locations, and I think, in fact, Helen's story about the customs process sort of illustrated the point quite well. She had to spend that time, and people couldn't quite understand why she needed to spend that time. But if we think about the broader context of firms operating in Africa and work that's being done in Washington, but not at the Brookings, but at the Center for Global Development by Alan Gelb and Vijaya Ramachandran and so on, using, I think, World Bank data that John was probably responsible for earlier on. Anyway, what they say is, and I find it very convincing, their work, is that in Africa in particular, shop floor productivity within factory productivity is not out of line with global standards, but the costs of doing business outside the shop floor, the logistics, the distribution, and so on, are much higher in Africa, and this is what undermines firm profitability. But what it also does is mean that management time has to be taken up in addressing those constraints. And you find in Africa, I think, in many firms, a lot of innovation around addressing those limitations rather than innovation related more directly to production, which might raise productivity. So we need to think about that in terms of the opportunity cost. So that's one point, and I think we want to be exploring that point a lot at ODI and more generally. The second point, and I'll make it much more briefly, Dirk, is to think very strongly about the linkage between FDI, which John talked about a lot, and global value chains, and for that matter, regional and domestic value chains, which he talked about, but much less so. Because if we're thinking about firms in Africa, manufacturing firms, inserting themselves into regional and global markets through value chains, then a lot of it will not be reflected in FDI per se. It'll be reflected in not what I would call non-equity relationships between foreign companies, multinationals, and local companies, which doesn't directly relate to FDI. And what I found in my work with investment promotion agencies in Africa is that they have a lot of difficulty understanding these differences, understanding how value chains actually work, and even more so thinking about how they can enhance their country's participation in those global value chains. So we need to focus, I think, a lot more on the FDI value chain interaction and in strengthening the investment promotion agencies, as John talked about. So I'll leave it there for time reasons. But
thanks very much indeed. We haven't got that much time, but I would like you all to take part in this thinking about this question that John was posing. Why is there so little industry in Africa? And I'd like you to put up your hand if you say that he did answer the question. So do your left hand if he did answer the question, and put your right hand up if he did not answer the question. Can I see some hands? You need to put up at least one hand. Very good. Okay. So
I think John and Nick together answered the question.
So on one hand we've got politics is important, and on the other hand we say, well, there's some economics that actually explain why there is now an opportunity for industrialization. Okay, so I would like to take a range of questions, and I'll just go across. I will take one round and then go back definitely to John and maybe some of the other of the panel to address some of the questions. So let's go here to the left, the two here at the front first.